My mother screamed, "You are my biggest mistake. Get out of here," kicking me out in front of my entire family at Christmas dinner. I was just leaving when her phone rang. It was her doctor calling to discuss the results of the bone marrow donors. She put it on speakerphone, and then the doctor said my name. I was the only matching donor who could save her life. The woman who had just called me her biggest mistake now needed me. How did she react to this bombshell? If you want to know, click the subscribe button. Having you here with us, subscribed, means a lot to us. It's great to share this and other stories with you. Now that you're subscribed, let me tell you from the beginning. They say money can't buy happiness, but growing up in my house, the lack of it sure bought us plenty of misery. I'm 35 now, sitting in my corner office in downtown Chicago, looking out at the skyline I once dreamed of conquering. My name is Sarah Mitchell, and I've spent the last 16 years building something my mother never thought I could, a life where I control my own destiny. But tonight, I have to drive to Milwaukee for Christmas dinner at my Aunt Linda's house, and I already know how it's going to end. It always ends the same way when my mother, Patricia, and I are in the same room. She'll ask for money, I'll say no, and she'll remind me what an ungrateful daughter I am. The only difference this year is that I've finally accepted something I should have realized long ago. Some people never change, no matter how much you love them. My childhood was a masterclass in financial chaos, orchestrated by a woman who believed credit cards were magic wands that made money appear. Patricia Mitchell could turn a grocery run into a shopping spree at Target, a simple utility bill into a crisis that required borrowing from 3 different relatives. I learned to read her moods by the sound of her heels on our kitchen linoleum. Quick and light meant she'd found another way to spend money we didn't have. Slow and heavy meant the bills had caught up to her again. Our little house in suburban Milwaukee was always one payment away from disaster, always one emergency away from another family loan. While other kids worried about homework and friends, I was calculating whether we could afford both electricity and groceries that month. I became the family accountant at 12, the voice of reason at 15, and the scapegoat whenever reality crashed into her fantasy spending world. The breaking point came during my senior year of high school, when she maxed out her 4th credit card buying furniture for a living room we were about to lose anyway. I found the receipts hidden in her jewelry box, $3,200 for a sectional, $800 for matching side tables, $450 for decorative pillows that cost more than most people's monthly grocery budget. When I confronted her, she looked at me with those green eyes I inherited and said the words that would define our relationship forever. "Sarah, you just don't understand how hard it is to be an adult." I was 17, working 20 hours a week at a local restaurant, maintaining a 4.0 GPA and balancing our family's checkbook because she couldn't be trusted with basic math. That night, I made a promise to myself. I would never, ever be financially dependent on anyone again, and I would never let her financial irresponsibility drag me down with her. I left for Northwestern University on a partial scholarship the day after my 19th birthday, carrying everything I owned in 2 suitcases and a duffel bag my Aunt Linda bought me. My mother cried as I loaded up my used Honda Civic, but they weren't tears of pride. They were tears of panic because her personal ATM was moving 4 hours away. "Who's going to help me when things get tight?" she asked, as if it were my job to fund her lifestyle choices. I promised I'd visit, promised I'd call, but I didn't promise to keep enabling her. Those first 2 years of college were brutal. I worked 3 part-time jobs, lived on ramen noodles and determination, and slept 4 hours a night so I could graduate with honors in business administration. Every time she called asking for money, I reminded her that I was eating peanut butter sandwiches for dinner so I could afford textbooks. But success has a way of changing people's expectations, and mine came faster than anyone anticipated. At 25, I was a junior marketing executive at a Fortune 500 company in Chicago, earning a six-figure salary and finally living in an apartment that didn't require 3 roommates. That's when the real pressure began. Suddenly, my mother's emergencies were my responsibility again, only now the amounts were bigger and the blame more sophisticated. It wasn't just about paying her electric bill anymore. It was about car repairs, medical bills, and mysterious loans she'd taken from friends that had somehow become my problem. I found myself writing checks for $2,000, then $5,000, then $8,000, each time telling myself it was the last time, each time knowing it wasn't. The woman who had called me selfish for wanting to go to college now expected me to finance the same irresponsible lifestyle that had traumatized my childhood. For 5 years, I played the role of the dutiful daughter and the family savior, bailing her out every time she painted herself into a financial corner. I paid off 3 different credit cards, covered 6 months of her mortgage when she decided to quit her job at the insurance company because her boss was mean, and even funded a bizarre business venture involving homemade candles that lasted exactly 2 months. My friends watched me stress over her latest crisis, watched me cancel vacations and postpone buying my own condo because I was too busy funding her disasters. My therapist, Dr. Chen, finally asked me the question that changed everything. Sarah, what do you think would happen if you stopped enabling her behavior? I sat in that comfortable chair in her Lincoln Park office, staring out at the trees, and realized I had no idea who my mother would be if she actually had to face the consequences of her choices. The decision to cut her off financially didn't happen overnight. It was more like watching a dam slowly crack under pressure until everything finally burst. I was 30 years old, recently promoted to senior marketing director, and finally ready to buy my own place when she called with another emergency. This time, it was $12,000 for some investment scam she'd fallen for, and she needed me to cover her losses before they came after her. Something in her voice, that familiar manipulation disguised as desperation, finally triggered the rage I'd been swallowing for over a decade. I told her no. Not maybe next month or let me see what I can do, but a clear, definitive no. The silence on the other end of the phone stretched for 30 seconds before she exploded, screaming about how ungrateful I was, how she'd raised me for 19 years, how I owed her everything. That's when I understood that our relationship had never been about love. It had been about money, control, and her complete inability to see me as anything more than a solution to her problems. Aunt Linda's house in Milwaukee always smelled like cinnamon and regret during the holidays, and this Christmas Eve was no exception. I pulled into her driveway at exactly 5:30 p.m., 30 minutes later than I'd promised because I'd sat in my car at a Starbucks parking lot for 20 minutes trying to psych myself up for what was coming. The 2-story colonial was already glowing with warm light, and I could see shadows moving past the windows. My cousins, Jake and Emma, probably my Uncle Tom setting up the folding chairs, and somewhere in there, my mother. Patricia's silver Honda was parked right behind Aunt Linda's Subaru, which meant she'd arrived early, probably to get her story straight about whatever financial crisis she was planning to dump on me tonight. I grabbed the bottle of wine I'd brought and the gift bag containing a $50 Amazon gift card for Aunt Linda, took a deep breath of the cold December air, and walked toward the front door like a condemned woman approaching the gallows.
Sarah! Aunt Linda's voice was warm and genuine as she opened the door, pulling me into one of those hugs that reminded me why I loved her so much. She was Patricia's older sister, but somehow she'd inherited all the emotional stability and financial sense that had skipped my mother entirely. The living room was decorated exactly like every Christmas I remembered. The same artificial tree in the corner, the same red and gold garland draped over the mantel, the same ceramic nativity scene that had belonged to my grandmother. My cousins were sprawled on the couch watching A Christmas Story for probably the 100th time, and Uncle Tom was in his usual spot by the fireplace, nursing a beer and pretending to read a magazine. But my eyes went straight to the kitchen, where I could hear my mother's voice rising above the sound of clinking dishes, already holding court about something that was probably going to become my problem before the night was over. "She's been here since 3, Aunt Linda whispered in my ear as she took my coat, and I could hear the warning in her voice. "She's agitated about something. Just be prepared." I nodded, squared my shoulders, and walked into the kitchen where Patricia was arranging cookies on a plate with the kind of manic energy that usually preceded a financial meltdown. She looked up when I entered, and for just a moment I saw my own face looking back at me. We had the same green eyes, the same stubborn chin, the same way of pressing our lips together when we were thinking. But where I'd learned to control my emotions and channel them into success, she'd let hers control her entire life. "Oh, look who finally decided to show up," she said, not quite loud enough for the others to hear, but definitely loud enough for me to get the message. "I was starting to think you were too important to spend Christmas with your family." I forced a smile and kissed her cheek, tasting the familiar combination of White Shoulder's perfume and barely concealed resentment.
Dinner was a carefully orchestrated dance of small talk and landmine avoidance, with everyone trying to maintain the illusion of family harmony, while Patricia dropped increasingly obvious hints about her latest financial struggles. She mentioned her car making strange noises 3 times, complained about the cost of her prescription medications twice, and made pointed comments about how lucky I was to have such a stable job with good benefits. Uncle Tom tried to redirect the conversation to safer topics like the Bears' disappointing season and Jake's upcoming graduation from UW-Madison, but Patricia had that look in her eyes, the same predatory focus I'd seen 1,000 times before when she was circling her prey. I ate my ham and mashed potatoes in silence, counting down the minutes until I could politely escape, knowing that the real confrontation was still coming. Every time I caught Aunt Linda's eye, she gave me a sympathetic look that said she knew exactly what was happening and wished she could stop it. The explosion came during dessert, triggered by what should have been an innocent comment about my recent promotion to marketing VP at the agency. I'd mentioned it casually, just making conversation, but Patricia's fork clattered against her plate, and suddenly every voice in the room went quiet. "Must be nice," she said, her voice sharp enough to cut glass, "to be so successful while your own mother struggles to keep her heat turned on." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees as everyone realized we'd crossed the line from tension into open warfare. I could feel my cousins shifting uncomfortably in their seats, could see Uncle Tom's jaw tightening, could hear Aunt Linda's sharp intake of breath, but I was done pretending, done protecting everyone else from the truth about what Patricia really was. "Mom," I said quietly, setting down my own fork, "we've talked about this. I told you 5 years ago that I wasn't going to keep bailing you out of problems you create for yourself." What happened next was like watching a dam burst in slow motion, except instead of water, it was 15 years of accumulated rage and resentment flooding the room. Patricia's face turned red, then white, then red again as she stood up so fast her chair scraped against Aunt Linda's hardwood floor. "You ungrateful little bitch," she hissed, her voice shaking with fury. "I sacrificed everything for you, gave you everything, and this is how you repay me? By abandoning me when I need you most?" The words came pouring out then, how she'd fed me and clothed me and put a roof over my head for 19 years, how I owed her everything, how I'd turned into a selfish, heartless woman who cared more about money than family. I sat there listening to this familiar litany of guilt and manipulation, feeling strangely calm as she revealed her true self to everyone in the room. And then she said the words that would echo in my head for the rest of my life.
You want to know the truth, Sarah? You are my biggest mistake. Get out of here. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the sound of my chair scraping against the floor as I stood up. I could see the shock on everyone's faces. Jake's mouth hanging open, Emma covering her face with her hands, Uncle Tom looking like he wanted to disappear into the wall, and Aunt Linda staring at her sister in complete horror. I grabbed my purse and coat, moving with the kind of mechanical precision that comes when you're too hurt to feel anything at all. I was halfway to the front door when Patricia's phone rang, the sound cutting through the thick silence like a fire alarm. She answered it automatically, her voice still shaking with adrenaline. "Hello?" Then I heard her gasp, followed by the words that would change everything. "Dr. Morrison? Yes, this is Patricia Mitchell. You have news about the bone marrow test?" She hit the speakerphone button, probably wanting to share what she assumed would be good news about my sister Jessica, and suddenly Dr. Morrison's professional voice filled the room. "Mrs. Mitchell, I have excellent news. We found a perfect match for your bone marrow transplant. Sarah Mitchell's test results show she's completely compatible."
The silence that followed Dr. Morrison's words was so complete, I could hear the grandfather clock in Aunt Linda's hallway ticking away the seconds of my mother's shock. Patricia stood frozen in the middle of the dining room, her phone still on speaker, her face cycling through confusion, disbelief, and something that might have been horror. "I'm sorry, doctor," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Did you say Sarah Mitchell?" Dr. Morrison's professional tone remained unchanged. "Yes, ma'am. Your daughter Sarah's HLA typing is a perfect 10 out of 10 match. When can we schedule her for the preliminary consultation?" I watched my mother's legs give out as she sank back into her chair, the phone slipping from her trembling fingers. Around the table, my family stared at me like I'd just materialized out of thin air, their faces reflecting the same question that was probably written all over mine. When the hell had I gotten tested to be my mother's bone marrow donor? "Sarah," Aunt Linda's voice cut through the fog of confusion, and suddenly everyone was looking at me for answers I didn't have. "When did you get tested?" The question hung in the air like smoke, and I felt my mind racing backward through the past few months, trying to piece together a puzzle I didn't even know existed. Then it hit me, like a freight train. 3 months ago, when I'd gone for my annual physical with Dr. Peterson in Chicago, she'd mentioned that my mother had been asking about genetic compatibility testing for some kind of medical procedure. I'd been distracted, stressed about a major client presentation, and I'd agreed to let them run some additional blood work without really paying attention to what it was for. I think I got tested without realizing it," I said slowly, my voice sounding strange and distant, even to my own ears. "My doctor said Mom had requested some kind of family medical screening. I thought it was just routine genetic testing." Patricia's phone was still on speaker, and Dr. Morrison's voice crackled through the silence again. "Mrs. Mitchell, are you still there? I know this is wonderful news, but we do need to move quickly. Your condition has progressed, and we'd like to schedule the transplant within the next 6 weeks." That's when the full weight of what was happening crashed down on all of us. My mother, the woman who had just called me her biggest mistake and ordered me out of her sister's house, was sick. Really sick. Sick enough to need a bone marrow transplant. Sick enough that her life depended on finding a compatible donor. Sick enough that she'd been secretly having her family tested without telling anyone what was really going on. I looked at her across the table. This woman who had shaped my entire life through her chaos and selfishness. And for the first time in years, I saw her not as my tormentor, but as someone who was genuinely afraid. "Mom," I said quietly, and the word felt foreign in my mouth after everything that had just happened. "What kind of condition?" She looked up at me with those green eyes that mirrored my own,
and I could see decades of pride crumbling in real time. "Acute myeloid leukemia," she whispered, the words falling into the room like stones into still water. "They diagnosed me 18 months ago. I've been through 2 rounds of chemotherapy, but it's not working anymore. The doctor said my only chance is a bone marrow transplant from a family member." Aunt Linda gasped and reached for her sister's hand, and I could see Uncle Tom's face go pale. My cousins looked like they'd been slapped, and I realized that I wasn't the only one who'd been kept in the dark about Patricia's illness. She'd been carrying this secret alone, facing her mortality while still finding the energy to fight with me about money and guilt and all the petty grievances that suddenly seemed so incredibly small.
"Why didn't you tell us?" Aunt Linda's voice was thick with hurt and confusion. "Linda, we've all been tested. You, Tom, Jake, Emma, even Jessica. None of you were compatible." Patricia's voice was gaining strength as she spoke, as if admitting the truth was somehow liberating her from the weight of carrying it alone. "The doctors said my best chance was with one of my daughters, but Jessica's test came back negative. I had Sarah tested without telling her because..." She paused, looking directly at me with something that might have been shame, "because I knew she'd say no if I asked her directly, because I knew she hated me too much to help me." The words hit me like a physical blow, not because they were cruel, but because they were probably true. If she'd called me 6 months ago and asked me to get tested to save her life, would I have done it? Or would I have seen it as just another manipulation? Another way for her to make her problems into my responsibility? Dr. Morrison's voice interrupted my spiral of guilt and self-reflection. "Mrs. Mitchell, I hate to rush you, but I do need to know if Sarah is willing to proceed with the donation process. We'll need to schedule her for a complete physical and psychological evaluation within the next 2 weeks." Everyone turned to look at me again, and I felt the weight of their expectations settling on my shoulders like a lead blanket. This was it, the moment that would define not just my relationship with my mother, but my relationship with myself. The woman who had just called me her biggest mistake needed me to literally save her life, and everyone in this room was waiting to see what kind of person I really was. I looked at Patricia, really looked at her, and for the first time I noticed how thin she'd gotten, how the skin around her eyes looked papery and fragile, how her hands shook slightly as she gripped the edge of the table. She was dying, and I was the only person in the world who could stop it.
"I'll do it," I heard myself say, the words coming out before my brain had fully processed the decision. "Of course I'll do it." Patricia's face crumpled and she started crying. Not the manipulative tears I'd seen so many times before, but the raw, ugly sobs of someone who'd been carrying the weight of their own mortality alone for too long. Aunt Linda was crying too, and Uncle Tom was clearing his throat in that way men do when they're trying not to show emotion. But as I watched my mother fall apart with relief, I felt something shift inside me. Not forgiveness, exactly, but a kind of clarity I'd never experienced before. For 35 years, our relationship had been defined by her needs, her crises, her inability to take responsibility for her own life. But this was different. This wasn't about money or guilt or the toxic patterns we'd been trapped in for decades. This was about life and death, about being the kind of person who could look past years of hurt and anger to do what was right. And maybe, just maybe, it was about finally understanding that sometimes the biggest mistakes in our lives turn out to be the things that save us.
The drive back to Chicago that night felt like traveling through a different universe, one where the laws of physics had been rewritten and everything I thought I knew about my life had been turned upside down. I kept replaying Dr. Morrison's words in my head, perfect, 10 out of 10 match, and wondering how the universe had such a twisted sense of irony. The woman who had spent my entire childhood making me feel like a burden, who had just hours earlier called me her biggest mistake, was now completely dependent on me for her survival. I pulled into my Lincoln Park condo at 2 a.m., sat in my car in the underground garage, and called the one person who would understand the cosmic joke my life had just become. "Dr. Chen," I said, when my therapist's emergency line picked up, "I know it's late, but I think I need to talk through something that just happened. My mother is dying, and apparently I'm the only person who can save her."
The next morning, I sat in Dr. Chen's office at 8 a.m. sharp, clutching a cup of coffee like it was a lifeline, and trying to make sense of the emotional whiplash I'd experienced in the past 12 hours. "So, let me understand this correctly," Dr. Chen said, in that calm, measured voice that had guided me through 5 years of therapy. "The mother who has emotionally and financially manipulated you for decades, who you've spent years learning to set boundaries with, now needs you to undergo a medical procedure to save her life." I nodded, feeling the weight of the situation settling on my shoulders like a heavy coat. And the irony isn't lost on me that she had me tested without my knowledge because she assumed I'd say no if she asked directly. Dr. Chen leaned forward slightly, her expression thoughtful. "Sarah, what do you think about her assumption? Do you think she was right?" The question hung in the air between us, and I realized I didn't have an honest answer. By the time I left Dr. Chen's office, I had a plan, not just for the bone marrow donation, but for how I was going to handle the entire situation with my mother. I wasn't going to be the same pushover daughter who had spent years enabling her destructive behavior, but I also wasn't going to let her die out of spite. I was going to save her life, but I was going to do it on my terms, with conditions that would protect both of us from falling back into the same toxic patterns that had defined our relationship for 35 years. I drove straight to Northwestern Memorial Hospital, where Dr. Morrison had agreed to meet with me to discuss the donation process. As I sat in the sterile waiting room, surrounded by other families dealing with their own medical crises, I felt a strange sense of calm settling over me. For the first time in my adult life, I was going to have real power in my relationship with Patricia, and I was going to use it wisely.
Dr. Morrison turned out to be a soft-spoken woman in her 50s with kind eyes and the kind of gentle authority that comes from years of delivering life-changing news to families in crisis. "Sarah," she said, as we sat in her office overlooking Lake Michigan, "I want you to understand exactly what you're agreeing to do. Bone marrow donation is a serious medical procedure that requires general anesthesia and carries some risks, though they're minimal. You'll be in the hospital for 1 to 2 days, and your recovery time will be about 2 weeks. She walked me through the entire process, the additional blood tests, the psychological evaluation, the preoperative procedures, and the surgery itself. But what struck me most was when she said, "I also want you to know that you can change your mind at any point up until the day of surgery. This decision has to be entirely yours, free from family pressure or guilt." I almost laughed at the irony. Here was a stranger giving me the permission to say no that my own family had never offered. That afternoon, I called my mother for the first time in months, and when she answered on the first ring, I could hear the hope and desperation in her voice. "Sarah, did you talk to the doctor? Are you really going to do this?" I took a deep breath and launched into the speech I'd been rehearsing since leaving Dr. Morrison's office. "Yes, Mom, I'm going to do it. But we need to talk about some things first. I'm not doing this so we can go back to the way things were before. I'm doing this because it's the right thing to do. But I have conditions. The silence on the other end of the phone stretched for so long, I thought she might have hung up. Finally, she said, "What kind of conditions?" Her voice was small, cautious, like she was afraid of scaring me away. The kind that are going to change our relationship permanently. And if you're not willing to agree to them, then we need to have a very different conversation about what happens next.
I met Patricia at a coffee shop in downtown Milwaukee the next Saturday, neutral territory where neither of us had the advantage of being on home turf. She looked smaller than I remembered, more fragile, and I could see the toll that 18 months of chemotherapy had taken on her body. But when she looked at me across the small table, I saw something I'd never seen before in her eyes. Genuine fear, not just of dying, but of losing her last chance at having a real relationship with her daughter. "I've written down my conditions," I said, pulling out a folded piece of paper from my purse. "I need you to listen to all of them before you respond, and I need you to understand that these aren't negotiable." She nodded, her hands wrapped around her coffee cup like she was trying to absorb its warmth. "First, you're going to start seeing a therapist to work on your financial issues and your tendency to manipulate people when you don't get what you want. Second, you're going to attend family therapy sessions with me after you recover from the surgery. Third," I continued, watching her face carefully for any signs of the old Patricia who would have exploded at being given ultimatums, "you're never going to ask me for money again. Not for emergencies, not for bills, not for anything. If you have a genuine financial crisis, you'll figure it out like every other adult in the world, or you'll ask other family members for help. But your financial problems will never be my responsibility again." I paused, letting that sink in before delivering the final condition. "And if you ever speak to me the way you did on Christmas Eve again, if you ever call me a mistake or tell me I'm ungrateful or use guilt and manipulation to try to control me, I will walk away from your life permanently, regardless of your health situation." Patricia sat in silence for a long moment, tears streaming down her face, and I could see her processing the reality that her daughter was no longer the frightened, guilty young woman she'd been able to control for so many years. Finally, she looked up at me and said, "You're right to ask for all of that. I've been a terrible mother, and if saving my life means becoming a better person, then I agree to everything." The morning of the surgery arrived, with the kind of crisp, February clarity that makes Chicago look like a postcard, all blue skies and glittering snow. I woke up at 5 a.m. in my hospital room at Northwestern Memorial, not because I was nervous about the procedure, but because I felt strangely peaceful for the first time in months. Patricia was 3 floors above me, probably awake too, preparing for the transplant that would either save her life or mark the beginning of the end. Dr. Morrison had explained that the next 72 hours would be critical. My bone marrow would either engraft successfully and begin producing healthy blood cells, or her body would reject it, and we'd be back to square one. As I lay there, watching the sunrise paint the walls of my room gold, I realized that regardless of what happened medically, something fundamental had already shifted between my mother and me. For the first time in our relationship, we were both showing up as adults, with clear boundaries and honest expectations. The surgery itself was surprisingly anticlimactic. I went under anesthesia at 8 a.m. and woke up at 11:30 a.m. feeling like I'd been hit by a truck, but alive and intact. Dr. Morrison appeared at my bedside with a smile that told me everything had gone according to plan. "We harvested an excellent sample," she said, checking my vitals on the monitor beside my bed. "Your mother is receiving the transplant as we speak. Now comes the waiting game." Aunt Linda had driven down from Milwaukee and was sitting in the chair beside my bed, looking more worried about me than I felt about myself. "How are you feeling, honey?" she asked, squeezing my hand gently. "Like I just did something that's going to change everything," I replied. And I meant it in ways that had nothing to do with the medical procedure. Over the next 2 days, as I recovered from surgery, I found myself thinking not about the past or even about Patricia's prognosis, but about what kind of relationship we might be able to build if she survived this.
Patricia's recovery was slower and more complicated than mine, which Dr. Morrison had warned us to expect. For the first week after the transplant, she was isolated in a sterile room, while her immune system was essentially non-existent, vulnerable to any infection that might prove fatal. I visited her every day after I was discharged, sitting outside her room and talking to her through the glass partition, both of us wearing masks and maintaining the physical distance that somehow felt symbolic of where we were emotionally. But something had changed in the way she looked at me. There was gratitude, yes, but also a kind of respect I'd never seen before. "I keep thinking about what you said in the coffee shop," she told me during one of these conversations, her voice weak but clear through the intercom system, "about me never asking you for money again. I realize I don't even know how to have a conversation with you that isn't about what I need from you." The turning point came 3 weeks after the surgery, when Dr. Morrison delivered the news we'd all been hoping for. The transplant had been successful, and Patricia's body was producing healthy blood cells for the first time in over a year. "It's still early," she cautioned, "but all the indicators suggest that your mother is going to make a full recovery." I was standing in the hallway outside Patricia's room when I got the news, and I felt something I hadn't experienced in years, genuine happiness about something involving my mother. When I walked into her room and saw her sitting up in bed, color returning to her cheeks for the first time since Christmas, I realized that saving her life had somehow saved something in me too. "We did it," she said, reaching for my hand. And for once, the word "we" felt accurate. This hadn't been about her taking from me or me giving out of obligation. It had been about two adults making a choice to fight for something better.
Patricia's first therapy session was scheduled for 2 weeks after she was discharged from the hospital, and she asked me to drive her there, which felt like a small but significant gesture of trust. Dr. Sarah Kellerman was a financial therapist who specialized in helping people understand the emotional roots of their money problems, and I could see Patricia's nervousness as we sat in the waiting room together. "What if she thinks I'm hopeless?" Patricia asked, fidgeting with the strap of her purse. "What if I can't change?" I looked at this woman who had given me life, who had nearly lost her own, who was now sitting beside me, genuinely trying to become a better person, and I felt something I hadn't felt in years: hope. "Mom," I said, using the word intentionally for the first time since Christmas, "you survived leukemia and a bone marrow transplant. I think you can handle learning to manage money responsibly." When Dr. Kellerman called her name, Patricia stood up with the kind of determination I'd only seen from her when she was fighting for something she wanted to buy. Our first family therapy session took place 6 weeks later in Dr. Chen's office, with Patricia sitting across from me in the same chair where I'd spent years processing the damage our relationship had caused. It was surreal watching my mother in the space where I'd learned to set boundaries with her. But Dr. Chen navigated the session with the skill of someone who understood that healing family relationships requires both parties to show up authentically. "Patricia," Dr. Chen said gently, "Sarah has shared with me that your relationship has been complicated by financial issues and communication patterns that haven't served either of you well. What's your perspective on that?" I watched my mother take a deep breath, and when she spoke, her voice was steadier than I'd heard it in years. "I think I spent so many years seeing Sarah as my safety net that I forgot she was supposed to be my daughter. I made her responsible for problems that were mine to solve, And I used guilt and manipulation when she tried to protect herself from my chaos. 6 months later, I'm sitting in my office in Chicago, looking out at the same skyline that has witnessed my entire adult life. But everything feels different now. Patricia and I talk twice a week, real conversations about her therapy progress, my work, books we're reading, plans for the future. She's been clean from financial crisis for 127 days, a number she tracks like someone in recovery, which, in many ways, she is. Last week, she called to tell me she'd gotten a part-time job at a local bookstore, not because she needed the money, but because she wanted to prove to herself that she could earn her own way. "I know it's not much," she said, "but it's mine, and I didn't have to ask anyone for help to get it." Yesterday, Dr. Morrison called with Patricia's 6-month test results. No signs of leukemia, blood counts normal, prognosis excellent. As I hung up the phone, I realized that we'd both been given a second chance at life, Patricia literally, and me emotionally. Sometimes the people who hurt us the most are also the ones who teach us the most about forgiveness, strength, and the complicated mathematics of love. My mother was my biggest mistake for 35 years, but she turned out to be my greatest teacher too.